Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Fly podcast. This is the first stream of the year. Glad to have you guys back. Keith, Swithun, Terminal Philosophy. We're here to discuss where have all the ideas gone. So, one of the things that I've noticed, whether you're looking at the slew of superhero movies that Hollywood's been producing for the last, 15 years now, and they seem to have no ability to come up with anything new or creative, and you look at modern political discourse where the politicians are proposing ideas that didn't work 60 years ago when they were invented, but are still being pushed today, even though it's clearly not working. And then even if you look at like quote unquote dissident circles, they have modes of analysis that are just clearly out of touch. For the anarchists, everything is haymaker, 1890. For the libertarians, everything is the communists around the corner. So, Russia 1917. For the progressives, it's always, 1939 when Hitler starts World War II or something. There's always the secret Hitler. And yet, all these ideas they're just not new or creative anymore. We're not having these new ideas that are allowing us to deal with these new problems. And one of the things that I sort of see here as at least four vectors for why this is the case is one is woke capital. So why is woke capital, pursuing this, groupthink and ideological conformity and all of this stuff? Well, if we look at like entrepreneurship, the currency of entrepreneurship is creativity. And you need to see a new idea. You need to see something that nobody's seen yet. So that's, some sort of like an intuition. And then you use that to then gain an advantage in the market. And these people know that. That's how they became these tech giants. But you can't foresee every contingent possibility if you're on top, which does give the entrepreneur an advantage because he only needs to find one chink in your armor, like say the chink in Smaug's armor in The Hobbit, and then he can bring you down. So the way that you prevent anybody from seeing that is by ensuring that everybody has to say and do and think the right approved things. And therefore anything that could lead to a entrepreneurial breakthrough is prematurely stifled, which gives the woke capitalists this sort of defense against the very people that they themselves used to be when they were coming to power. Another thing that might cause this is if we use Baudrillard's idea of the simulacrum. So if we look at, like, say, classic movies and music from the 60s and 70s, at their best, they were still tied into something real. So Star Wars, for example, the Force is kind of like Buddhism. The Jedi are sort of like samurai. There's still some loose connection to historical realities. But now we just have, pop culture citing pop culture citing pop culture, where you basically have this complete, simulacrum simulation, which is only pointing to other simulations and not anything real. And so because we've seen that growing in the sort of like tech industry, pop culture, we have this radical disassociation from anything real. And it's only by making an appeal to the real or experiencing the real that gives us the food for thought, so to speak, to come up with new ideas. The third category is politics. The idea is as a political system becomes old and sclerotic and rigid, think of it, the Catholic Church in the 16th century, it becomes very fearful of criticism or even just new ideas, right? New ideas might just be perceived as the potential venue for new criticism. So, like, for example, with the treatment of Galileo, right? Galileo is coming up with new ideas which weren't necessarily a threat to the Catholic Church, but they overreacted because they were afraid of what was already going on with Luther. And so new ideas at the political level and across the country are suppressed because, one, it might undermine the status quo by asking uncomfortable questions, or it hasn't proven itself to be sufficiently ideologically reliable to support the current status quo. And then lastly, the uncertainty in American life. In the 60s and 70s, when a lot of these pop culture icons and IPs were created, America was safe, prosperous, and rich. And that's not the case. Well, it's still rich for some people, but it's not really the case anymore. Most people are wondering where they're going to get food. If, many parts of the country, we have lots of crime in cities. Are you going to have your store broken into and robbed? There's going to be a drive-by outside your house. Uh, and the whole sort of sense of safety and solidarity that allowed people to not worry about the mundane things of life like security and food and be creative and poetic and whatnot, that's rapidly going away too. So I think all four of these are factors that are contributing to the lack of ideas in America today. Swithin, I want to get your thoughts, especially on the first part about capitalism.
The capitalism point is interesting. I think that's, you could argue to a large degree, is due to the current level of concentration. As Keith has pointed out, and others, most of the these large organizations are basically ultimately owned by the big investment funds like BlackRock, Vanguard, etc. And they're run by a certain set of people who think things should be done a certain way. And if you want to deviate from that, then they, won't invest in you. There's something interesting with respect with woke capitalism. I was talking to some guy about this, and apparently this guy was saying he was, so an interview with a guy called Kevin O'Leary, and I'm not sure who he is, but they talked about Exxon. I think he's an investor who said he thought it was a bargain at the time, but then he went on to say that you would never buy it because it had a terrible environmental and social governance rating that would prevent investors using big hedge funds like BlackRock from buying it. And he thought that this meant that the long-term stock price will suffer even if the dividend and the valuation is okay. So there seems to be some very high-level investors are very, very much invested in it's basically environmental and social governance rating. It basically probably is a proxy for wokeness. I mean, I can't really see how it would be anything other than that. And so they seem to really care about this stuff. And I think it's related as well with the ideas with the political aspect, is that when you get to a sufficient level of concentration and power, there's just not as many outlets to be able to use new ideas. It is also the case that new technology as well at the moment. I mean, you did have the period of like the early 2000s where the internet was, well, it obviously existed in the 90s and earlier, but it became big and there was new things to do. And then it's all become sort of ossified now. And doing anything new, I mean, you kind of had like over the last few years, like the corporate takeover of like people like YouTube. He said, no, obviously YouTube was owned by Google, but they had that time where they basically demonetized everybody for all the small YouTube channels. And then this precipitated the crazy Iranian woman going to shoot up YouTube, if you remember that, who had the weird fitness videos, who was a vegan, and claimed that YouTube were taking like all her revenue stream and stuff. This was all predicated on the idea that somehow all these corporations who had adverts before ISIS videos and somehow it's just damaging their reputation. And so we couldn't really monetize the smaller channels. It's like, well, no. Like, so you get this corporatization, and same with politics as well. I think this is a function to a large extent of obviously old sort of political models, but also the fact that you have such a large centralized state in so many countries around the world that you can't do different things because there's literally no space in which to do it. And obviously you got sort of general sort of geopolitical hegemony with the USA, which is to some extent declining. But in say South America, you can't have your socialist experiment or quasi-socialist experiment because the Americans will just remove the leader and replace him with somebody else. So I suppose in some sense it's sort of like a competition thing on there with capitalism, and also with although when it comes to the investors and BlackRock and stuff, why are they so invested in the environmental social governance stuff? That is an interesting question. Maybe they think it'll make them more money in the long run, or maybe they think it's the right thing to do, or that really BlackRock and Vanguard or whatever are really sort of the private finance arm of the state in some respects. I seem to remember reading that, like, it was BlackRock and Vanguard had close ties to the Obama administration, and was one of them originally like a defense contractor. They have some sort of close ties with sort of like the deep state to some extent. When it comes to Hollywood, I think the issue with the arts in general is really what you have is from the 20th century, possibly early late 19th. You have basically the culture of critique. And no, I'm not going all Kevin McDonald at this point necessarily, but that the philosophy is set up in antagonism basically to white Western Christianity. And you see this in things like, I mean, Bergman's a good example. He's very well regarded amongst the critics, the Swedish film director from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. It's all mostly why God doesn't exist. And it's very sort of against sort of showing why God doesn't exist. But because it was like against something that I was actually some people believed and society as well, it kind of made sense in form of in an artistic sense. But once you just have continual critique, then there's nothing really to base anything on. And then you get sort of the very most of postmodern stuff, which is self-referential. And then there's the idea as well why the art can't create. Is a good example is really the Star Wars franchise, which I might have mentioned before when it comes to 7, 8, and 9. It's obvious from the end of 6 that what you really should have is an attempt really rebuilding the Republic. But what they do instead is they reset it back to 4 and go, oh no, we have the new order, which is based the Empire. We need to rail against it. And then they change it as opposed to it being against like a quasi-Nazi organization. It's just a generic, white people against the Rainbow Coalition. But again, it's an antagonism against something. They can't build anything. So I think it's a turn of sort of deconstruction in a sort of philosophical movements, which has influenced the arts as to why they don't really produce anything. And so they just have to keep going back to stuff that had been produced historically and, inverting it and subverting expectations and doing all that and just deracinating it. So those have been my thoughts on the capitalism, political, and the artistic.
All right, Keith, what are some of your thoughts on these points?
There's a lot to unpack there. As far as the issue of woke capital, I do think that is very interesting. And as far as any commentators I know of who've written about that, the one that I think has the most insight is probably Michael Lind. He points out that if you look at the demographic of people who might be identified with woke capital today, it's very similar to the kinds of liberal Republicans we used to have in past generations. For example, nowadays, of course, when you think of Republicans, you think of Trump voters and you think of maybe Reaganites or neocons or something like that. But back in the day, we used to have a lot of what used to be called liberal Republicans associated with people like the Rockefeller family. And this is the tradition that the Bush family comes out of. I mean, this was what the tradition that Nixon came out of. So this was a well-established tradition in American politics. But you had people that were affluent and wealthy, often extremely wealthy, but who would put a lot of effort into funding all sorts of social causes and cultural, exercising cultural influence and things like that. For example, a lot of the pro-life people will point out the role of some of these folks in promoting Planned Parenthood and contraception and abortion and things like that. It's not true that rich people are inherently conservative. I mean, they may be conservative about certain things, but when you look at the history, for example, of right-wing anti-communism, what you typically see is that the super capitalists were not nearly as anti-communist as, say, the petty bourgeoisie or like small capital or like feudalists or like Catholic traditionalists and people like that. That's who tended to back hardline, right-wing anti-communism. Like the John Birch Society in America was a hardline anti-communist group, but that's where they got their funding and financing and support from. It wasn't from people like the Kennedys and Rockefellers and Vanderbilts and all of that kind of stuff. So the higher you get in the class strata, the more you see this, the more you see that you have people who really have so much money they don't really have anything to do. They're too rich to care about anything. Um, and you see that tradition continuing today. Like instead of the Rockefellers promoting, say, Planned Parenthood and conservation, ecology, that was another thing that was popular among a lot of those sectors. Population control. They were always really worried about population control. That's why they were so big in on Planned Parenthood. But nowadays, you see these same sectors, the super rich, promoting all kinds of public health programs. Like distributing AIDS drugs to Africa, or now they're big on vaccinations. Obviously, Bill Gates, that's one of his things. You see them also getting into space colonization now. You've got Musk and Bezos and these guys that were talking about colonizing space. It's like they've got all the money they need. Now let's just play Star Wars. I mean, that's kind of what they are. They're like 12-year-olds playing Star Wars, only they've got the money to make it real. And then you've got the way that a lot of the super elites nowadays, they embrace all the environmental causes. They embrace animal rights and all kinds of stuff. And then they're getting into stuff like what's that thing where you freeze your body to so that you can
Cryogenics.
Yeah, cryogenics. Yeah, I mean some of them are into that kind of stuff, or transhumanism. I think Peter Thiel, I think that's what that founded PayPal. I think that's one of his things is transhumanism. The idea, well, in the future you're going to be able to just saw off your arm and grow another one or whatever. So I think a lot of the woke capital is coming from that sector. It's basically just a lot of super rich people who don't have anything else to do, so they're just looking for ways to exercise power or influence or make themselves important. With some of the revelations that have come out lately about pedophile rings in elite circles, like with Jeffrey Epstein and all that kind of stuff, I mean that's very similar to things you saw in the past as well. Like you used to have the super decadent wing of the aristocracy, like the Marquis de Sade types, that were into all kinds of weird sexual, fetishes, just as a matter of indulgence because they don't have anything else to do. And so I think a lot of the woke capital is that. It's also true that, as the Marxists will point out, every ruling class, every state has a self-legitimating ideological superstructure, and typically it's built based on what at least on the surface seems credible to ordinary people. For instance, the ruling classes of the Middle Ages might appeal to Catholicism and the divine right of kings or something like that, or in earlier times in American history they'd appeal to the Constitution or George Washington or something of that nature. For whatever reasons, those things don't have as much influence now. So now they'll say, well, the government is good because it's fighting climate change and letting gay people get married and fighting racism and all this other kind of stuff. So all ruling classes have to have some kind of means of legitimizing, or at least creating the aura of legitimacy to their own rule. And as far as what we see in with the investor organizations, and that kind of stuff. One thing I'd point out there is that at that level, there's no separation of business and state. I think one problem with a lot of Marxists and libertarians both is that they don't really seem to understand the ways in which business and finance and economic life generally and the state are interconnected. The Marxists have this idea, well, it's like economic concentration just grows out of the market, and then the most successful competitors in the market, well, they just take over the state, and then the state is like the executive committee of the ruling class. And then the kind of free market or libertarian rendition of that is more the opposite. We know that the state is the enemy of business and the marketplace and all that. But at the most elite level, I don't really think there's any real separation of any of that. It's more like what you would find in a feudal society, where even though the aristocrats and the clerics and the monarchs and royalty and all that might have disputes with each other, they're still part of the wider power elite apparatus. They're not separate in terms of being external to some kind of governing structure. And entertainment and all that is interesting, the way that's gone. in my case, I've always thought maybe it's just an age thing, but it does look like they just keep doing the same stuff over and over and over again. Like, how many Star Wars movies have they made now? Like, 20 or something, and they do that with everything. Like anything that becomes successful, they just kind of run it into the ground. Now, I think some of that is just business. I mean, obviously, if something becomes, I mean, the entertainment business is a business, so anything that becomes profitable, they just want to milk it for all it's worth until they can't keep doing it anymore. I mean, you see that in everything. You see that in musical styles. Back in the 80s, you had rock bands that had the spandex outfits and the poofy, teased out hair and that kind of stuff. And that kind of stuff became such a cliche. It was like a uniform, it was everywhere. And then all of a sudden you had grunge rock come along, and it was just the opposite. You had performers that dressed like homeless people and that kind of stuff. But then you had everybody trying to milk that, and that became a cliche. And So it just looks like anything that becomes successful, they try to bleed it for all it's worth. But then that has the effect of lowering the quality over time as well. I mean, how many reboots have they done of old TV series or old movies or stuff like that? Like I see come across. I don't follow pop culture on that level very intensely, but occasionally I'm seeing where they like I know they've done remakes of a lot of old TV series from the 70s and 80s, like Dallas and Dynasty. That kind of stuff was around when I was younger, like in high school or whatever. And now they're doing modern versions of all of that, or they go back. They'll go and remake old movies. Only they'll remake the old movies in a way that's now politically correct. Like they'll make sure it's like a black guy that plays the lead role or something like that. So yeah, I mean, I think a lot of that is just money. They think, okay, that worked in the past. That movie was successful back in 1975. Let's do a modern version. Let's make it compatible with contemporary culture. And let's just see how much money we can make out of it. Doing something original is more risky because you don't know if it's going to succeed or not. So they don't want to invest $50 million in making a movie if they think it's going to fail.
All right, terminal philosophy.
All right. Well, yeah, this is a really interesting question. I would say, whether or not it was intended, people seem to be becoming more and more similar to each other. I mean, just socially speaking, modern people seem to only be able to interface with others through pop culture references and things like that. I think this is also the case for the global population in general, although probably to a lesser extent in comparison to the United States. But so many people globally now. I mean, even impoverished populations have smartphones and things like that, and so that kind of allows for a similar stream of ideas to be more accessible by larger populations. I would say, in regards to U.S. politics broadly, I would say that the U.S. government is so heavily dependent on lobbying, and this is sort of a problem because it only allows for certain special interests to be able to influence some of our political elite. And I would say also in general to that, just taking a big step back and looking at U.S. politics, I would say that democracy, or at least our voting system, does not really incentivize long-term thinking or long-term goals. We typically are either thinking about 4 or 6 year voting cycles. And so what that seems to do is incentivize, short-term goals and sort of aims at vague long-term goals. And I think that, again, while I'm not trying to advocate for some sort of, Babylonian boy king to take power and now we can get back to, more interesting societal heroic goals. The problem is democracy is so far in the other direction of that we really have such a short attention span in regards to politics in general. And, this is, of course, with the, with 4 to 6, 6 years for senators, 4 years for presidents and things like that, it makes it really, really difficult to plan for the future. And so, yeah, I think that is a problem with just democratic voting systems in general. And, in regards to Hollywood, well, I think Keith had a really good point in the sense that Hollywood is just simply too afraid to lose money on new ideas. And I totally agree with Swithun on his point about Star Wars and how when the last trilogy was released, or this most recent trilogy, well, The Force Awakens was just sort of this rehash of A New Hope. And I think it has some decent moments, but a lot of people were waiting for this, like, this potentially exciting new chapter in the Star Wars universe. But really all we got was A New Hope with a few extra bells and whistles and really incredible visuals. But that was really about it. And so, you could say even the same thing for the for the Star Trek films, which are directed by J.J. Abrams. By which I mean these newer Star Trek films are all based off of the James Kirk timeline, and we already have been there in the 60s and 70s with James Kirk and his crew and a lot of the antagonists that came from that universe. In Star Trek, the show, in Star Trek Deep Space Nine during the 90s, at the end of the series, something called the Dominion War had concluded, which is this massive galactic-sized conflict that involved all different kinds of factions, and it was this highly cataclysmic ending to a series, and it was really exciting, and people were interested to see where things were going to go next. But because Hollywood seems to be so determined to just stick to old formulas, well, they did this sort of bizarre, Star Trek multiverse BS where they could just go back to the Kirk timeline and they could involve Leonard Nimoy, who's, the actor for Spock. And, and it was all just kind of just a nostalgic, it was deferring to nostalgia almost exclusively and nothing else. And, that was kind of disappointing just to, we had already done the Kirk timeline. Like, what are we doing? And then, I think, so there's definitely a problem of just not taking any risks in Hollywood. I once, talked with Right Ruminations for a while about my favorite film, Blade Runner, and how that movie was technically on paper a flop, but it's aged considerably much better than most films of the last several decades because, well, it's just a different film altogether. It's kind of a noir. It's kind of an action film. It's kind of this introspective sort of thing. So there's not really films like that coming out these days because there's just no risk taking. And then I'll say with regards to woke capitalism, it just seems like at this stage in history, the consolidation of wealth sure does seem to suggest that the U.S. is representing more of a plutocracy than anything else. These larger businesses, especially with COVID, this huge consolidation of wealth where corporate America is coming in to fill the void left by a lot of smaller private businesses. It's really sad, unfortunately, but that seems to be the direction of things. And, BlackRock, all of you guys covered this fairly well, but it seems like BlackRock is just turning the U.S. slowly into a renter society. And, when you can no longer own a home of any kind, and if you can no longer have a stake in society, I really wonder what the direction of things will be for the average person.
Yeah. Now, risk was mentioned by you, Keith, and we are an increasingly risk-averse society. So if you compare like earlier periods in American history, life on the frontier, people were willing to take a great amount of risk for their expected reward. And I think there's a couple of reasons why we're more risk-averse. First of all, during the the westward expansion, while the risks were high, the rewards were high, and the people who shouldered the risks got the reward. Whereas now, a lot of the reward is parceled out to people that didn't take any of the risks, and in fact, people that don't even deserve it. And then you've also got the penalty for failure. So, the penalty for failure could be steep. If you went out west, you might just die. Today, if you fail, you might even lose your position within the status quo, and you can't come back, right? They don't forgive any mistake that you make. They'll dig through 20 years of your social media feed to find anything they can use against you, if they think they have to. So part of this is this, and of course, risk aversion is also due to uncertainty, right? So beginning in 2008 with the financial crisis, the effects of which have never really gone away. Life becomes more and more uncertain, and so without certainty, it's difficult for people to sort of de-stress enough to then deal with these other more, I guess you might say, luxury items like ideas. But I think also too, if we look at what needs to be in place for there to be creativity in the first place, and then work back, what do we have to have and what don't we have? I mean, one thing you have to have and one thing we don't have is a highly literate population. I mean, on a superficial level, it might appear that people are literate, but we're seeing the return to images, especially on digital technology. Bill Lynn has famously said the 3,000-year battle of the word against the image is being lost to the image again. And if you don't have people that are literate, there's a certain kind of escape velocity that once you have a certain amount of intellectual firepower under your belt and enough literary concepts and ideas, you can then start building on the last. So if we look at like the creativity in the Western literary tradition, there were those who in the Middle Ages read, Homer and Virgil, and they, like Dante, then he created the Divine Comedy. But he had to read all that stuff first. You have to be familiar with all of these other ideas. But people don't deal in ideas anymore. They deal in images. And so as we move from a textual idea society, we become an image instinct society. And I think a lot of that including risk, aversion, feed into this lack of creativity, especially when we need it most. Swithun, what are your thoughts?
I think when it comes to risk, first thing is when it comes to films, I bet the literacy point that you mentioned before. Just with films, is interesting to note is what you see now in films, you have a very big difference between the high budget films and the lower budget films. The sort of mid budget films don't tend to get made very much these days, and the large budget ones try to be as mass market as possible in their appeal, to basically make the money that they need to. So as ever, you're never going to get a particularly interesting film which has over $100 million budget. That's not true. The only exception to that is probably Inception of recent times, which was actually an ideas-based film more than anything else, even though it had the trappings of basically an action film. When it comes to, I do think we are becoming a more an image-based society, although I don't necessarily think that that's contrary to ideas as such. Although it is certainly the case, the extent to which people just basically watch film and TV rather than sort of reading sort of expositions of sort of ideas and essays and philosophy or something like that. I think that makes a difference. Although I don't really think there's necessarily a huge difference between the novel and the TV series or the film. Now, there are ways that you can deal with sort of introspection and possibly more sort of ideas in certain respects, although I'm not entirely sure that there are benefits and weaknesses to both media, and it's not obvious either way whether one is necessarily better at conveying ideas than the other. When it comes to things like Homer and the classics, I mean, that's an interesting point. To what extent do you need sort of like a common wellspring of content, as it were, to then base the rest of sort of the cultural creation around? It certainly helps for referencing, and if the source materials is quite deep, it gives you a lot sort of to work with and to reference. I suppose you could say that, yes, we've replaced the classics with the Marvel Cinematic Universe or the Marvel Comics. And it's just that, well, in general, very much less deep, much less rich source of ideas and insights into sort of as quote unquote the human condition. So that is possibly a problem, because it relates to the question when it comes to innovation and creation, is to what extent you need to be let free, and to what extent you need sort of constraint. Because in a way, you don't just want to be completely constrained to follow what has been done before, but then at the same time, just going off and doing, well, one of the worst things an artist can be is trying to be innovative, because that basically means you end up not being innovative and producing things that aren't particularly interesting. That's what you tend to be the case. So I think having an idea, I suppose you could have. Oh, let's put it this way: if we take the general sort of, this might be a way to think about it: is whatever is sort of the cultural bedrock of existing sort of society, which you could say historically was like Christianity in the West. That kind of has the Bible and all the church fathers and everyone writing around it to create some sort of body of ideas from which, a society can work from. Whereas now, I mean, you're left with, oh, everybody's racist, oh, critical race theory, etc., which is a much more sort of shallow view of the world, and less sort of deep. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean it's more or less correct, but there's less things to kind of go off it. So maybe an aspect here is to what extent the how deep and rich is the ideas and sort of ideology which sort of underpins the existing society. I think that might be an interesting one. And so to the extent to which a deeper sort of theological tradition has now been jettisoned, that gives fewer resources upon which to work.
All right, Keith.
Well, one thing that we mentioned when we were planning this episode is the a lack of originality that you see all across the spectrum of thought. We've been talking a lot about entertainment and art and that kind of stuff, films and those kinds of things. But you see the same thing in politics. Like nowadays, you're increasingly seeing people who are trying to dust off all of these archaic philosophies from the 20th century, or they're trying to find some kind of prototype for everything that's going on in the world in past events in ways that I think are somewhat off the mark. One of the most obvious examples is the way that everything is now fascist. I mean, if we look around the entire Western world, probably the closest thing that we have to an actual fascist party that has any kind of influence at all would probably be the Golden Dawn in Greece, which is illegal in Greece. That it's considered the equivalent of the mafia or something like that. I mean, there's really nothing even remotely similar to the historic fascist movements, or certainly not the Third Reich, anywhere in the developed world. And yet everything is constantly being compared to that. You see, of course, in the United States, the Trump phenomena being compared to that. I mean, which I think is absurd. I mean, if I had to compare Trump to some figure from the American past, it would probably be to some degree someone like Richard Nixon, perhaps. Although he's got sort of a more maverick component to it, maybe more like Ross Perot or somebody like that. But Trump is squarely within American traditions, and of course, when yesterday was the 1 year anniversary of the January 6th thing, and that's often compared to the beer hall push in Germany in 1923, which I think is silly. People who make those kinds of analogies, I think, don't really understand American history. They don't understand how violent a lot of American history has been, or how contentious a lot of American history has been. I mean, go back and look at the election of 1800. If you want to see some contentiousness associated with American elections. And we see that with people getting into things like you have these people that they call tankies, the neo-Marxist Leninists, I guess, or neo-communists. They're going back and they're trying to dust off Stalin and Mao and these guys from the 20th century. And this kind of thing seems to be mostly popular on YouTube for whatever reason. And but in many ways, that scene is kind of a parody of old guard communists. Like if you actually had American communists from say the 1930s who were here today and they saw that kind of stuff, I'd be curious to see what they thought of it. My guess is they wouldn't have a very high opinion of it. And then you've got this phenomena of bread tube. I know they have a war going on with the tankies now because I guess the bread tube is to the tankies what the Congress of Cultural Freedom was to the old Communist Party or something like that. The CIA Marxists or something of that nature. And then you see that on the right as well. On the dissident right, I'm increasingly seeing people, and this isn't new, but people embracing all kinds of lunacy. Like one thing that seems to be popular among the dissident right is to convert to Eastern Orthodoxy, and this is by people. I mean, that's fine if I would say that's fine if you have some kind of personal or familial or cultural or community roots in Eastern Orthodoxy. Like if you're a Greek American and that's part of your heritage, and you're Russian American or Romanian American or something like that, sure. But when I see the people from the Midwest, the American Midwest, going off and converting to Russian Orthodoxy and talking about how Russia is the third Rome or something like that. I mean, to me, they might as well just be people that are obsessed with comic books or something. It's because it seems about as serious and it's about as relevant to anything significant as that. And you see, it's not just that. I mean, you see that in all kinds of ways. And we have this incel phenomena too. These basically young men that are just total losers in every aspect of life, for whatever reason, and we see a lot of that drifting towards these all these strange philosophies. Like I come across people like on social media that seem to change their political affiliation or change their religious affiliation virtually every week. Like I know some that have been virtually 10 different things in the time that I've known them. Well, they were a Mormon, then they were Eastern Orthodox, then they were a Muslim, then they were Hindu, or they were a third positionist, and then they were a Marxist Leninist, and then a Nazbol, and then a Trumpist, and then whatever they are now. And I think that a lot of that is indicative of people not having any sense of direction or sense of who they are. And it's also interesting how there's no new ideas there either. Like I always think, well, this is relevant to 21st century North America. Exactly how? And it's usually it just seems it's like the equivalent of these clubs where people dress up like medieval knights and go out and have fights with plastic swords and stuff like that. And I think that I do think what a lot of that is rooted in is the fact that the wider society is fragmenting. It's like that book that was written some years ago, Bowling Alone, where they were talking about, well, people don't really belong to anything anymore. Instead, it's all just about consumption, and people tend to be more atomized. And I think this is reflective of that. And also the fact that the conventional cultural narratives have kind of broken down or fallen into disrepute or no longer seem legitimate. So people are going off embracing all these kinds of alternative identities and stuff like that. Like you have on the left, you have people. Everybody's got their Black Lives Matter logo with the fist and that kind of stuff, or the rainbow flag, the LGBT or whatever. And you've got that parallels to that on the right as well. So it just seems the culture is fragmenting. And a lot of people are just kind of dusting off all kinds of weird stuff, trying to figure out where they can fit in.
All right, terminal philosophy.
Well, That is an interesting point that you brought up earlier, Todd, in regards to aversion to risk. I mean, I have to agree that this appears to be true everywhere in regards to Hollywood and the arts and entertainment and things like that, as well as in politics. And I agree with Keith's point that about this general tendency for so many people in the West, or at least in Western politics, referring to X as fascist. Over the course of the last several years, I've really enjoyed reading Stanley Payne and Paul Gottfried and their works on fascism. If you read either of these authors, a large part of their work tends to agree on the idea that fascism is simply not around today. I mean, perhaps, the one exception being, it being more of an internet phenomenon. But, whether or not, I mean, Keith, you mentioned a while ago that, people in the 60s and 70s would call, Richard Nixon a fascist and Donald Trump is a fascist, or, various elements of the Democratic Party are fascist. And once you, if you take the time to actually read a historical work on fascism, fascism and third positionism are not as clear cut as, say, something perhaps like communism or capitalism, but they still have a specific criteria. And, it's just been devolved to a little more than a swear word. And, I think if you go back to, our Star Wars comparison, these last recent movies, I mean, it's just a tired, worn out analogy to, fascist dictatorships of the early 20th century. And so there really is no sort of interesting ideas going on in the arts. I mean, I always thought, I mean, again, this is just me, but if there were going to be any more Star Wars films coming out, there would be some sort of exploration to the dark like the underworld or the crime world of the Star Wars universe, or some sort of now that the Empire has been destroyed, there's fragments of it, and that that maybe it exists on only a handful of systems, and that creates a new basis for a storyline. But no, they just kind of they recycle the old ideas, and they clearly just haven't done much with that. And but yeah, I generally tend to agree that fascism is just this swear word. And yeah, I mean, I think the Golden Dawn, I think there is some speculation on the dissident right as to whether or not that China may or may not resemble a sort of fascist or quasi-fascist state, and I think that's an interesting conversation. Yeah, and then of course you have far left, dissident left types where tankies are trying to integrate identity politics into their ideology, which is increasingly bizarre. I think it's true to say that early 20th century communists would have viewed this sort of proliferation of identity politics as, like hyper individualism and counter revolutionary. And I have mentioned this to several, so-called tankies and, in the recent past with folks like Fellow Traveler and Infrared. And, well, Infrared's kind of a different story, but as far as Fellow Traveler, I mean, I think there's just a real conscious effort to try and do this bizarre dance of appealing to, what we call idpol, and then also towing the line of like old school Marxism or early 20th century revolutionary Marxism. And it's just difficult for me to imagine how those potions will even mix well together. But yes, and now, back to Todd's original point, I think that what you see now is just, you see kind of a quasi reward system in regards to rewarding people for not taking too much of a risk, for just kind of going with a sort of, Nietzschean herd mentality, if you can call it that. And yeah, I mean, we're really just seeing not only a consolidation of wealth in the top level, I think we're really witnessing a consolidation of ideas, and you're seeing clear boundaries that are drawn that really just tend to limit, I think, creative thinking. And unfortunately, I think, it's just going to have to get a lot worse before it gets any better.
All right. So we'll move into the final statements now. Well, we'll start with you, Swithun.
Another point that came to mind with respect to the lack of risk taking, which I think is worth noting, is twofold. Firstly, is as we've got further to be in the 20th century in the West, the society's become ever more credentialized and formally educated. And how do you become formally educated and get lots of certificates in your name is by doing what other people tell you to do. What you have to do, you have to please your professor. You have to do what they want you to do, otherwise you don't pass. You have to please your schoolmaster, otherwise you fail. And you have an ever increasing situation which you have to please somebody else to achieve it. And this is also true as well, the expect with the ascent and the further concentration of power in certain businesses. The extent to which you're in a corporate structure, to a large extent, is the extent to which you just have to be highly agreeable and climb the ladder. You can't be particularly innovative, otherwise you're going to be well, you could suffer for that in a way that if you had smaller firms or self-employment, whatever, that would be more conducive to innovation. Related as well to this, and I think this is possibly more of a recent phenomenon, I think, especially with the breakdown of the family, people don't want to take risks because they've been such a unstable background that they have to try to create order everywhere. And so they want to minimize risk and have safe spaces because they don't have the sufficient individual identity to be able to take risks. As an aside, this is you may or may not have come across a guy because Matthias Desmet, who was I think he's a Dutch psychologist who argues with respect to coronavirus, it's a situation what he calls mass formation. Prior to 2020, the most diagnosed mental illness was generalized anxiety. People in modern societies are just generally anxious. And they don't know why. It's not like there's a tiger out there who's going to kill them. They just have this general sense of things aren't right. And these tend to be people associated that don't have particularly good social relations with other people, and have and this has sort of been accelerated into like the 20th and 21st century. And these are the sort of true believers in sort of the coronavirus madness, because it's a way of externalizing their anxiety onto something that's out there. Oh, this is what's been making me feel anxious and bad, is this clear external threat, and they can build sort of an identity around it. And that's a slightly point to the side. But the lack of stability and upbringing, I think we get the SJWs, who to a large extent are from poor family backgrounds, at least the most militant ones seem to be. And it's a way of sort of creating order because they can't cope with anything that's slightly disruptive, because disruption to them means sort of like, I don't eat or I get beaten or I'm abandoned, as opposed to, oh, this is interesting, sort of stimulating sort of activity. So I think that's an additional consideration here.
All right, Keith.
Well, the point about people being risk averse, I think, is interesting because we've really seen an explosion of that during the pandemic. Like for a lot of people, it seems like no measure is too extreme as long as it prevents one person from getting COVID or something like that. I mean, I would tend to approach it more from the angle, well, there's a lot of different things that have to be balanced against each other. Health is one, but that's not the only thing. But I've seen that the nanny state culture just kind of go off the deep end during the pandemic. It's the same kind of thing where I know, for example, when I was growing up, we used to have what were called latchkey kids, and that was, you had kids that, say, both of their parents had jobs, so the kids would get off of school buses and they would wear a necklace with had their house key on it, so they wouldn't lose their house key, and then they to let themselves into the house when they got in from school. And it was not uncommon, for kids to walk to school on their own if they lived near their school, and that kind of thing. And nowadays, parents that did that would probably be arrested for child abuse or something. Like I saw a report a couple of years ago about a case where somebody was 7 minutes late picking up their kid from school, and they called CPS for child abandonment or something. So this kind of thinking has become extremely pervasive. You see it in so many other areas. Speaking of schools, you have cases where kids are suspended from school for having chewing gum because it's a drug or something. Um, like I had a friend of mine that her son was in the fourth grade, and he was suspended from school for the rest of the year for carrying a plastic water pistol, like a little child's toy water pistol. Like like he's going to do a school shooting or something with a water pistol. And you see this in many areas of life. You see this everywhere, and now it's just kind of gone off the deep end with the pandemic. And it's interesting to consider where this kind of thinking is coming from. I tend to think it's all largely the product of having people that have lived their entire life in an affluent society where they never really had to face risks. I've made the point before that the reason you saw so many social liberation movements or whatever in the 60s is because that was the first generation for whom scarcity was not a major issue. If you're struggling to get food, you're not going to be worried about air pollution or gay rights or something like that. But I do think that in the time period of say the latter half of the 20th century, in developed countries, you had a lot of people that grew up in what were for the first time in history were post-scarcity societies, and they consequently started having time to develop all kinds of personal neuroses, because they had time to think about that kind of stuff, about how depressed they are, how anxious they are. And also, I think when you have people that are used to living in a safe and secure environment, that can become pathological to where you become risk phobic in a way. And we see that now. I mean, like a good example is the D.C. area. I live about 2 hours south of Washington, D.C. And in the D.C. area, they've got the strictest COVID policies anywhere in the United States. And that area, the suburban areas outside of D.C. In Virginia and Maryland, are the wealthiest areas in the entire United States. So it's interesting how you have the people who are the most privileged and the most affluent who seem to be the most averse to risk. Like they're panicked that somebody might breathe on them and they might get a COVID germ or something like that. It's almost like a Howard Hughes type of situation where somebody's like a hyper germaphobe. So it seems to me a lot of this kind of stuff is a product of just having a very affluent culture where most people, or many people, can live a risk-free life much of the time, and also that's starting to decline now. We also see a process of social unraveling and that kind of thing, where people are increasingly facing risks of different types that they are not accustomed to. So that may be fueling some of this as well.
All right, terminal philosophy.
All right, well, I don't have too much more to add, but I would just have to agree with Keith's general comment just now that, people are so terrified of risk that it becomes its own sort of bizarre pathology. I think Todd, you and I talked about this somewhat recently in private, but I think we were probably part of Swithun too. I think the three of us were probably part of the last generation of people who, of kids who just grew up playing outside and just, you just like go off into the woods and play for several hours and then come home when it gets dark. And that was it. I mean, nowadays it's the kind of the helicopter parenting plus the, I would say, this proliferation or the expansion of like the nanny state too is just so ubiquitous in every single way that it makes people kind of crazy in a sense. I don't know what to do about all this. I think, as far as the arts and entertainment goes, the only thing, at least recent, that is something, one of the only movies that's come out recently that I thought was interesting was, again, I'm being a bit biased here, but Blade Runner 2049 from Denis Villeneuve, which I think was a really good film, just because it was, it wasn't another Marvel film that was entirely green screened. It was, there's a lot of themes going on. It wasn't just one type of movie. So I think people really need to kind of go back and do their best to read the Western canon and get refamiliarize themselves with old adventures and the Homeric tales and things like that, in order to just get a sense of what makes a good adventure a good adventure, what makes a good story a good story. I think I'll end with that. Thank you.
All right. Thanks again, everybody. Keith Swithun Dobson Philosophy. Always a pleasure. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. This is Todd Lewis to the Praise of Flight podcast, signing off.